Good evening. Today I'm going to be talking about contemporary Australian poetry. This is part of our MEG 9 course, which is a second year optional in the MA English program. Now, when the title of this blog says it's contemporary Australian poetry. Now, when is art really contemporary? An answer to that is say when the moment of production is identical or very close to the moment of reception. That means poetry or art is being produced at the same time or a few years earlier to the time when it is being read, or it is being discussed, or it is being watched or performed. So in other words, contemporary Australian poetry is that which is being composed by poets even as you and I talk today. And the subtitle of this particular section that I'm going to be doing today, this particular block, is called Contemporary Australian Poetry 1970 onwards. Now this is just to remind us that in this case we are looking specifically at poetry that is written from the 1970s to the present day. And in other words, it is poetry with which you and I more or less share a whole generation. But at the same time, terms, as I've always told you, literary terms always create confusion. That leaves a lot of room for discussion and debate about what it actually means and what it could include. So similarly, the word contemporary also denotes not just a factor of time, but a certain quality of mind as well, which has to do essentially with the continuing evolution and the changes that are taking place in society even as we speak. And it suggests that there is geography, history, or organized space and organized time. These elements are in fact being reconstituted before our very eyes. And now when I did this block on poetry earlier, we discussed the poems of Kenneth Slessor. That was in block 4, and he was one of the modern Australian poets. Now Kenneth Slessor, what he does is he maps Australia in a certain way, and we are very conscious that there's something new is actually being done. And to quote from his very famous elegy, 5 Bells, now look at the image that he creates with his poem. Night and water, pour to one rip of darkness. The harbour floats in air, the cross hangs upside down in water. Now look at the way the word cross is used. Okay. Now traditionally the Southern Cross to which he refers here is a very specific Australian cultural marker, and it denotes Australia, which is the island in an island in the southern hemisphere, and hence it seems to be upside down, because as I told you in my introductory talk on Australia, the beginnings of Australian literature, when we were discussing the physiography of Australia, I did tell you that when the northern hemisphere has its summer, Australia has its winter. And while in the northern hemisphere, and in particular England, because Australia has very strong ties and links with England, while the trees shed their leaves in the autumn, in Australia it is the tree, or the eucalyptus tree, which actually sheds its bark. So in a sense it denotes a world which is upside down to readers who are majorly Eurocentric and primarily based in the northern hemisphere. Now Slessor's modernity is seen in the way he uses this image to try and evoke a sense or an image of the world that is down under. And he dissolves a stable image of Australia rather than construct such a stable image as a traditionalist would have done. And since Slessor evokes not the constellation, but rather its upside down reflection in water. So now this is what Slessor did, and this was at a slightly earlier period. Now by the time we are actually coming down to contemporary Australian poetry, you have a poet like Les Murray who disturbs this image even further. And I'll quote from one of his poems, "The cross hangs headward down. Light sprinkles down on terri of the Lebanese shops. It mingles with the street lights and their glare." Now see what Les Murray is also trying to do is tell you in not so many words that the Australia of today is far more complex, far more complicated than the Australia of the past. For instance, now the Southern Cross of Murray, again he's referring to the continent, It shines on a world which is now very, very pluralistic in every sense. And this particular poem is called the Budaliya Tari Holiday Song Cycle. And it also suggests and evokes the memories or the experiences of the indigenous peoples of Australia. Because song cycles are normally the traditional poems or the traditional songs of creation, the myth of creation that belong to the Aboriginals of Australia. And Les Murray also he also includes the experiences of the immigrants. Now you have to remember that Australia for a very long time was a white country. Then it opened its doors to the rest of the world and encouraged immigration in a very big way, and it changed into a multicultural, its policy changed into a multicultural policy. So now you also have the experiences of the immigrants. For instance, when he talks about the Lebanese shops, and then the image that he's trying to create in these two lines that I quoted earlier is also of suburbias or small towns, and of many other worlds which we will come to share and come to learn about as we go further into this section on the contemporary Australian poetry. And the word contemporary, as I was telling you earlier, is sometimes more puzzling than even the word modern. Because contemporary by definition means it is a happening time. It is still going on. It hasn't gone into the past as yet. And today what we'll try and do is introduce the Australia of today through the political and cultural experiences that have shaped her in the last quarter of the 20th century. And we will also probably discuss the works of specific poets, and the poets that are being looked at largely in this block on contemporary Australian poetry is Bruce Daw, Les Murray, Chris Wallace-Crabb, Gwen Harwood, Ee Thiang Hong, Kevin Gilbert, Mudruru Nurugan, and Jake Ryan. And when we are doing the poems of these 8 contemporary poets, we will also try and place each poet in terms of 2 contexts. 1, the socio-cultural context, and 2, the literary context of their writing. And this will, in fact, what this will help us do is to trace the development and trends in contemporary Australian poetry. Now, more specifically, what we shall try and do now is look at political, social and cultural issues that have shaped Australia since the 1970s to the present day. And we will try and look at these issues and to see if it lends into an examination of the themes and the contents of contemporary Australian poets and their poetry. Now you have to keep in mind the fact that the issues discussed here as ongoing, they need to be understood as ongoing cultural experiences rather than as specific historical events or movements. It's not something that has occurred and has passed. It's not that. It is still happening, right? So we have to try and understand it as something that is going on, as a cultural experience that is going on, that is likely to go on, which might change in the future. And you have to also remember that the poems are to be used only to the extent that they clarify the issues that we are actually trying to discuss. Now, on what kinds of history does contemporary poetry in general rely for its issues and themes? Now that becomes a very, very crucial question for us to understand. What is the background, or what is the material that is being used by poets in order to bring out the issues and the themes that they are trying to look at or they are trying to write about? And how does it work these different histories into its structure and shape them into poetry? That's another aspect that we need to continuously keep in mind as we read their poems. And this brings to mind a very short poem by the British poet Philip Larkin, who died in 1998. And this poem, it also suggests some very good answers to these questions that we are raising today. Now, let me just quote the poem. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Up till then, there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for a ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then all at once the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same, and every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. Now, what is Philip Larkin telling you in this poem? First, look at the way in which the subject of the poem, which is basically he's talking about the sexual revolution, is discussed. Now, it is not discussed just as the sociological phenomenon that took place, but more importantly, what he's doing is using it as a cultural landmark. So contemporary poetry, what it does, or what the contemporary poets try to do, is they use very, very apparent objective or historical data as indications of something that is extremely subjective or of psychological change. Next, look at the cultural, the markers of cultural change that are used. In 1963, he does mention, and I go back to that quote, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Now, in 1963, the legal ban on D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover was lifted in Britain. And the result was a sense of artistic freedom from censorship in the world of high culture. And in the world of popular culture, what was happening simultaneously was the release of the first long-playing record by the Beatles. And this suggested in a sense that British pop music had actually come of age. So look at the way he's used these two images to actually give you a sense of time and space, and also to give you a sense of what was happening around at that particular point of time. Then look at the way in which a contemporary poet like Larkin constructs a personal space within an apparently public enclosure. Now, the period of growing up or puberty or adolescence is the shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. That's the quote, the lines he uses. But it is evoked immediately after he talks about after the picture of Victorian prudery, where personal feelings are supposed to be smothered in the interest of public priority. So then we go back to that quote where he says, up till then, they'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for a ring. So what he's also trying to tell you is, because of that sense of Victorian prudishness, the Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned. So finally, in 1963, the ban was lifted, and it signified a sense of artistic freedom. Finally, we must also consider the appraisal the poem gives us age, as it tries to evaluate the very dubious balance of profit and loss that characterizes the new liberation. Then all at once the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same. And every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. Now, so in this sense, keeping this poem in mind and where we've begun from, where we've noticed how Philip Larkin tries to place cultural markers, tries to place markers and indicate the time and the place of the poem, of the society, and he tries to give you a feeling of the social texture, the social fabric of that time. It brings me back to my question, how does contemporary Australian poetry handle the challenge of evoking the Australia of today? So for that, what we can do is look very quickly at the first half of a Les Murray poem called The Broad Bean Sermon. Now, beanstalks in any breeze are a slack church parade without belief, saying trespass against us in unison. Recruits in mint Air Force darken with unbuttoned leaves. Upright with water like men, square in stem section, they grow to great lengths, drink rain, keel over all the ways, kink down and grow up afresh with proffered new green stuff. Above the cat and mouse floor of a thin bean forest, snails hang wrapped in their food. Ants hurry through several dimensions. Spiders dance and sag like little black flags in their cordage. Going out to pick the beans with the sun as high as fence tops, you find plenty and fetch them. An hour or a cloud later, you find shirtfuls more. At every hour of daylight appear more that you missed, ripe, knobbly ones, fleshy-sided, thin straight, thin crescent, frown-shaped, bird-shouldered, boat-kneeled ones, beans-knuckled and single-bungled, minute green dolphins at suck. Now, this poem, what it does, it evokes very sensitively, but clearly a very, very specific time and place. Firstly, it is clearly set in a time when belief in Orthodox Christianity is at something of a very low ebb. That means people's faith is wavering. They are not looking at Christianity as something that sustains their belief system, something that helps them along the way. Now, the preacher of the sermon is actually a patch of beans. And the first line stresses that commitment is slack and all are without belief, which indicates that people are losing their faith. And we must also keep in mind the selective parody of the Lord's Prayer, where he says, "Trespass against us," in unison. Now, the complete line in the Bible is, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Here, however, the beans are represented as saying, "Trespass against us." In other words, what the poet is trying to tell you in this particular poem is that the beans are asking to be picked, which is a very comic inversion of the original Lord's Prayer. Now, next, the poem is equally clearly set in a time of protest against militarization. Okay, the beans are compared to unenthusiastic raw recruits in the first para itself, where he says, "Recruits in Mint Air Force darken with unbuttoned leaves." Okay, so they are being compared to very, very unenthusiastic raw recruits and who are yet to learn to be alert as they turn up in their uniforms, which is very, very slovenly. And this, in fact, also is also indicative of the the response to the Cold War crisis in Vietnam, more specifically, and that we will deal with a little later when I talk about different issues and themes that we are going to be looking at today. Then look at the way in which the physicality of the human presence is established, where he talks about the beans. Okay, and the beans are upright, like with water, like men. They're fleshy and keel over always. Now, feminist poetry in Australia is deeply involved with an analysis of what constitutes the male presence. And this poem and these particular lines, "Upright with water like men," okay, "Keel over always, kink down and grow up afresh with proffered new green stuff." Now, these lines, in a sense, are indicative of what constitutes the male presence in Australian poetry. And this is no longer the Australia of the outback. Here we don't have, it's not something like Lawson did in his short stories, and or even Barbara Baton does in her Chosen Vessel. This is no longer the story of the outback and the ocean, or even the story of Australia of city and bush, where you had Sydney versus the bush kind of a dialogue. Although the beans are described in the third verse as if they constitute a forest, they could just as easily be the product of a vegetable patch in a suburbia. And here, once again, you get a picture of the new and complicated tensions of a landscape such as this. And now, what do you think of what do you think could be the consequences of internalizing the seascape in this way, as the beans are described in the final lines as minute green dolphins at suck? So what are we trying to create? What is the image that the poet is actually trying to create? And what else, what is the quality of life that is being evoked by such a poem? Now, if you have an understanding, or if you look at a poem like this and raise all these questions, you're going to have a fairly good understanding of the socio-political, socio-cultural, socio-economic situation of contemporary Australia. And now let us look at some of the political issues that were that affected poetry and literature and all arts since the 1970s. The closing decade of the 20th century saw a growth in popular sentiment in Australia that actually favored complete independence from Britain. The Southeast Asian Treaty Organization lasted from 1954 to 1975 and comprised the following countries: Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Pakistan, the Philippines, the United States of America, and Britain. And it came to an end largely because its member states were unable to agree on a common policy in Vietnam. Britain insisted that Vietnam was not an issue that concerned her directly, while Australia supported American intervention in Vietnam. And I've also told you about this, where thousands of Australian soldiers fought in the Vietnam War and lost their lives. Now, even before this, Britain's membership of the European Economic Community had been the subject of differences with Australia. And by now you will realize that the kind of link that was there between Australia and England. Now, in the very beginning, what we have to keep remembering when we are doing Australian literature or trying to study any aspect of Australian literature is that Australia began as a penal colony. It was discovered in 1788, and it was primarily meant to be a colony where the prisoners of the overcrowded prisons in Britain could be transported. So Australia chiefly was colonized to make it a penal settlement. And even then, after the first generation prisoners or convicts, they settled in Australia. Then the second generation came along. But that nostalgia, that longing from the mother country was always there, always present. It is there in their poems, it is there in their diary entries, in their journals, it is there in the fiction that they wrote, the novels that they wrote about. That longing, that sense, they could never really acquire that sense of belonging with this new land because it was so totally different from England. One, it was different from England by virtue of it being located in the southern hemisphere. Climatic changes were different. Secondly, the kind of the deserts, the vast open deserts, the harsh and hostile climate was something that they could not deal with. Thirdly, you have to remember that at the psychological level, they were uprooted from their culture, from their home country, and forcibly transplanted and transported to a new place, which was so far away from the homeland that it was all but obvious that that longing for the home country would be there. And we've seen ourselves, when I've talked to you earlier about Australian poetry in the beginning, about Australian short fiction, that Australia was never really able to sever its umbilical link with England for a very long time. And this by now, but when we now come to this contemporary Australian poetry, what we realize is that differences are cropping up between what an Australian national sense of national identity, national pride, and what Australia sees as Britain agreeing to or disagreeing with. Now, the increase in pro-Republican sentiment was a feature of Paul Keating's government, and finally in 1986 the Australian Acts ensured Australia's total independence of Britain. Now, these acts comprise a statute of the Westminster Parliament and a statute of the Canberra Parliament. Until then, Britain had retained residual powers of intervention in Australian federal as well as state matters. But with the passing of the Australian Acts, the Privy Council in Britain lost the right to hear appeals from Australian courts. So look at the kind of intervention that was happening between in Australia. Now, the status of Queen Elizabeth II as sovereign of Australia, however, remained unchanged. She signed the Australian Acts while on a visit to the country in 1986. Now, then we must also remember something more recently, that when Australians voted for a referendum when they wanted to either break away totally from Great Britain or Britain, where they didn't even want the Queen as their sovereign, or whether they wanted to maintain the status quo, we know the results of that voting, because Queen Elizabeth II is still the sovereign of Australia. Now, in what ways, if at all, does this distancing from Britain, or they call the home country or the old country, enter contemporary Australian poetry? As with all political shifts, the translation into cultural influences comes very gradually. And with a modern poet such as Judith Wright, whom we did earlier, the loosening of ties is anticipated. Now, this is an extract from her poem For a Pastoral Family. In England, we called on relatives, assuming welcome for the sake of a shared bloodline, but kept our independence. We would entertain them equally if they came, and with equal hospitality, blood being thicker than thousands of miles of waters, for the sake of great Aunt Charlotte and old letters. Now, already from these 6-7 lines, what we realize is that the relationship with England is already in the process, so to speak, of being put away. in lavender, or being slipped into an old photograph album. That is, it is in the process of being relegated to the past. And England is there as a point of cultural marker reference in the memory. It's not to be dismissed, but also at the same time is not to be used as a rule. And look at the ring of pride in the phrase where she says, we kept our independence. It is a very, very critical to a phase of national and emotional self-sufficiency, and this phrase deepens even more in contemporary Australian poetry. Now we look at Jig Ryan's Ode to My Car, where the use of England as an available point of reference is quite different from the way Judith Wright does in For a Pastoral Family. At least the mechanics are honest. My poor car, baby, you should be in England, not here withering. Though in the sun you can still not shine quite, but glow from within like a higher state. Thin wheel of mine lasts forever. Now here again, this dominant sense about England is derived from the popular culture, from popular imagination. And according to popular stereotyping, England is more refined, is more genteel than Australia, which is earthy, which is raw, which is pretty uncivilized, in other words. At the same time, it seems neither necessary nor desirable to contemporary writers that England be totally expunged from the national consciousness. Now, as Peter Potter, a poet who is Australian by birth but who lives as an expatriate in England, writes, and I quote, "You cannot leave England. It turns a planet majestically in the mind." Now Chris Wallace Cramp, who is another poet whom we'll be studying, he refers to this emotional bonding shown by Australian poetry to England as representing, and he calls it, the psychological hegemony of most natal or long adopted nations. Now what he is trying to say, in other words, is that England, in a sense, the way England is represented in Australian literature, Australian poetry, and the way this emotional bonding is depicted in Australian poetry, it represents the psychological dominance of most mother nations or old countries towards adopted nations. See, it could also be that the Australian imagination constructs England so that it can locate itself more accurately. Do you think this is possible? That I am trying to create or construct my view of England, okay? Since I am in Australia, I am an Australian, and the Australian imagination, or I am trying to construct an England so that I can look at myself more accurately. Is that a possibility? I leave that open to you. Now, when it comes to the question of Vietnam, which I mentioned earlier, from 1965 to 1973, there was a prolonged civil war going on between the communist state of North Vietnam, which was in a sense tacitly supported by the then USSR, and the non-communist state of South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States of America. So on one level, this was a phase of the Cold War, the ongoing struggle for world dominance, domination being fought out between two superpowers. Now you have to remember, before the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics broke up, they were a very, very major force to contend with, and we had two superpowers in the world in those days. One was America and the other was the USSR. So when there was this prolonged civil war going on between the North and the South of Vietnam, what was actually happening was the North, which was the communist state, was being supported by USSR, which was again a communist, socialist, Marxist country, or a union of countries, and the South of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, was supported by the United States. So what was actually happening is two superpowers, two global powers, were actually fighting for world dominance, but on somebody else's territory. And in this case, it was Vietnam. And on another level, though, the Vietnam crisis was a very, very testing time for Australia. Now, this would make us all think Australia is so far away from Vietnam, and Australia was not even a major superpower at that point of time. Or was not even a powerful country then. So how does it affect Australia at all? How is Australia related to this whole ongoing struggle between America and the USSR? The Australian government under Robert Menzies enthusiastically backed American involvement in Vietnam, despite Britain's refusal to intervene. Now we have to remember that what I just told you earlier, that Britain did not want to be a party to this at all. Australia intervened militarily in Vietnam, sending its first batch of combat troops in 1965. In 1968, the Australian military presence in Vietnam was at its strongest. Nonetheless, Vietnam was not a cause popular with the Australian public, and there was widespread condemnation of the government's policy of military intervention. And protest was exacerbated when Menzies introduced a system of conscript by ballot. So finally, because of all the public pressure, in 1972, Australian forces withdrew from Vietnam. But the human cost of Vietnam was very, very crippling. Over 47,000 members of Australia's armed forces had served in Vietnam, and more than one-third of them were conscripts. So Australia sustained roughly around 2,900 casualties, and these were people who were either injured or killed in the war. And apart from that, apart from the casualties, there was also a sense of the futility of the entire campaign. And when the with the withdrawal of the American support, a communist unification of the country finally took place in May 1975, with the entry of North Vietnamese troops into Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. Now, most of all, now that was what was happening in Vietnam, but in Australia, most of all, there was a sense of moral bankruptcy. What was the justification behind the intervention of the First World in the affairs of a peasant-based, poverty-stricken region, vastly inferior in terms of money, power and firepower? Where was the need at all? That was the question that was being raised. And much contemporary Australian poetry. Now, the reason why I'm telling you in so many details about the Vietnam War and Australia's involvement in the war is because much of contemporary Australian poetry is written in response to the Vietnam crisis, and it forms a very important theme, which is basically that of protest poetry. At times, specific aspects of the war are condemned, and at others, the policy as a whole is castigated. Now, this was the policy whereby Australia sent their troops to Vietnam for the first time in 1965. And there is a poem by Bruce Beaver, an extract of a poem by Bruce Beaver called Letters to Life Poets. And in this poem, he raises specific issues, and he also looks at the role that he is actually assigning to poetry. Now, let me quote from here. God knows what was done to you. I may never find out fully. The truth reaches us slowly here, is delayed in the mail continually, or censored in the tabloids. The war now into its third year remains undeclared. So basically, now this is a poet who is writing, and this is a poem about a person who is left behind in Australia, and is talking about what has happened or what may have happened in Vietnam. The war is now into its third year, remains undeclared. The number of infants, among others, blistered and skinned alive by napalm, has been exaggerated by both sides, we are told. And the gas does not seriously harm, does not kill, but is merely unbearably nauseating. Apparently, none of this is happening to us. I have to live near this, if not quite with it. Writing to you, writes Vietnam like a huge four-letter word in blood and feces on the walls of government. Reminds me when the intricate machine stalls. There's a poet still living at this address. Now, firstly, in this poem, there is criticism of the twin evils of censorship and propaganda, which are both enemies of the public and of the truth. And censorship tries hard to smother the fact of war and to delay the publication of all its attendant brutalities. Now, propaganda also institutionalizes deceit, and casualties are often disguised, which we know is happening even today, and discussions are hampered. And then there is also a condemnation of what is called collateral damage today, which involves the death of unarmed civilians in military attacks. Now we have to remember that when there is a war, when there is civil unrest, it is not just the casualties of war, and it is not just the military that is killed. Lots of civilians are also killed, and that is what we happily call collateral damage. And the horror of all of this is heightened by Bruce Beaver's pointing out that babies are being killed in unspeakable ways. Then there is again castigation of the hideousness of the military measures used. Chemical warfare is discussed, which is very, very inhuman and barbarous. And finally there is the poet's examination of the whole role of poetry and the relationship between the poet and the state during a time of war. And the business of the poet is therefore seen to be that of the keeper of the public conscience. It is his or her business to keep alive the sense of outrage over the moral filth of such a war, particularly when the state tries to smother such a sense. So the poet therefore emerges or is seen to be a humane and moral opponent of the very, very inhuman governmental machine, which is actually the state. And then you have other poets who focus on related aspects of war. And Bruce Daw, he again draws attention to the facelessness and the futility of what is militarism. And now in a very, very short extract from Homecoming, he says, all day, day after day, they're bringing them home. They're picking them up, those they can find, and bringing them home. They're zipping them up in green plastic bags. They're tagging them now in Saigon, in the mortuary coolness. They're giving them names. They're rolling them out of the deep freeze lockers. Now this is a very, very frightful and a very, very gruesome image that Bruce Daw is drawing our attention to. Here people are not people. They're being referred, they are looked at as just bodies that have been killed, that are casualties of war. They're being brought home. They're being sent home, they're being picked up from the fields, whatever parts that they can find, and they're being zipped into green plastic bags. In Saigon, they're being tagged, they're lying in the mortuary, and then they're being sent out home, back to their homes. Now for the military personnel killed in the war, the homecoming in body tags is very, very ironic, because they return voiceless, nameless and faceless, and their only identity is derived from their dog tags. Now if you've seen a couple of movies about the Vietnam War, you would have realized that even the American soldiers who went to war, they had a little black thread and a little metal chip which had their number on it. Now that was the only way of identifying a person. When your face is shattered, when your face is blown apart, there is no way that anybody can say, okay, this is Adam or this is John or whatever. But what identified you was that dog collar. Okay, so now when your body is coming home in a bag and it is just a collar, you become nameless, you're faceless, and you at the same time voiceless. Now before I talk about the social issues of contemporary Australia, there is a question has come in from IGNOU Regional Centre Jabalpur by a student of our MEG program. His name is Kunal Kumar Verma, and he says, ma'am, can we say that a true poetry is always feminine? Kunal, the answer to this is true poetry is not necessarily feminine. It will depend on what you mean or what you are trying to say by feminine. Okay, if you're trying to say that a poem that is written by a woman is feminine, that's one aspect. If you're trying to say that when a man writes like a woman, that is feminine, that's another aspect. But there is no such thing or no such rule that says that true poetry is feminine. Because we have some very beautiful poems, especially if you're trying to look, if you're a student of MEG 9 or Australian literature, you will realize that some beautiful ballads were written, like The Man from Snowy Rivers by A.B. Panjo Patterson, and his poem may have what you're calling feminine or feminine touches, or maybe if it's lyrical or because it's a ballad, you might be calling that feminine, but that was written by a man. So you cannot say that true poetry is always feminine. Now when we come to the social issues of contemporary Australia, then the most important thing that comes to mind is this whole thing about immigration and the whole thing about suburbanization. Now, in the 20th century, immigration became a vexed issue in Australia. Excuse me. On the one hand, one concern of government has been that expressed in the phrase the white Australian policy. Like I told you before, Australia actually followed a white Australian policy whereby only whites, or which was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were welcomed to migrate to Australia from Europe and the rest of the Caucasian world. The 1902 Act supported this policy by requiring a dictation test in a European language to be administered to any potential settler. Now, in 1905, the Act was modified so that the test now covered a prescribed European language. Again, there's a question from Jabalpur. Oh, this is just a repeat of the same question that I've just answered or tried to answer. Now, in the 1925 Act, what that Act did was it empowered the Governor-General to refuse entry to a group of aliens he might consider undesirable on the economic or the racial score. So just look at the kind of agenda that they had in mind. This Act was hardly used. The Ben Chifley administration 1945 to 1949 continued the white Australian policy. And simultaneously, there was another concern of government policy was to allow immigration when it seemed enabling to them. So as a member of the Commonwealth, like every other corporate settlement, Australia is the product of generations of immigrants comprising both pioneers as well as settlers. And after World War II, the Australian government agreed to the request of the Allies to allow immigration largely from Southern Europe. Now, it's always Europe, Eurocentric, okay? And also to help with the resettlement of ex-servicemen. So the challenge of immigration can be gauged from the fact that there were 750,000 immigrants who arrived between 1860 and 1900, and 3.5 million arrived between 1945 and 1985. But how has this challenge translated into cultural terms? And if you look at one of the immigrant writers or poets of Australia, Anya Walwich, you will try, in a sense, you will be able to understand the very multi-layered anxieties that have come across, that have been translated in cultural terms. Now, she calls this wogs. They're not us. They're them. They're them. They are else what you don't know, what you don't know. What they think they got their own ways. They stick together. You don't know what they're up to. You never know with them. You just don't know with them. No, we didn't ask them to come here. They come and they come and they come. There is enough people here already. Now they crowd us, wogs. They give me winter colds. They take my jobs. They take us, they use us. They come here to make their money. Then they go away. They take us, they rip us off landlords. They rise rent. They take us, they work too hard. They take us, they use us bosses. We work in their factory. Rich wogs in wog cars. Rich Jews in rich cars. They take us, they work so hard. We are relaxed. They get too much. They own us. They take my jobs away from me, wogs. They don't look like you or me. They look strange. They're strange. They don't belong here. They're different skin color, hair. They just don't look right. They take us. They land on us. There isn't enough space for us. Now they come. They work for less. They can work in worse. They take anything. They work too hard. They want from us. We have to look after our own here. Not let them. Let them go back. Where they come from, to their own. They're everywhere. They get everywhere. You can't speak to them. Why don't you learn to speak English properly? They're not like you or me. They're not the same as everybody. They change us. Is your child educated by an Australian? Now this is all one long sentence. And look at the kind of feelings, the kind of issues, the kind of resentment that is coming to the surface. And the speaker of the poem, in a sense, is shown to articulate a mindset which is filled with hostility towards immigrants. First, immigrants seem to embody the social unease of mainstream culture. Their insistence on group solidarity, on being unlike the dominant culture, angers those who consider themselves the only true Australians. Next, immigrants are said to create economic insecurity. But this is the same thing that has also been highlighted by papers that is happening in America, where outsourcing of work, BPO's work coming to India, is creating such problems. And the kind of resentment that Americans had towards Indians who are working there in the software IT industry. Now they are ready to work longer hours for lower wages, and thus they push white Australians out of the job market. Then the other thing that comes across is that immigrants, once they become rich, they reverse roles by employing white Australians and allegedly living off their work. So immigrants, in a sense, seems to be disturbing the patterns of land ownership, and they're altering the accepted work ethic, which affects Australian mentality, Australian mindset, a particular mindset to a very great extent. And then the whole thing about xenophobia, it reaches a crescendo with the overriding anxiety where they say, are Australian children safe from cultural contamination by the wogs? So the whole organizing principle of irony in the passage is that of a whole series of anxieties, be it social, economic, cultural, and they are identical on both sides of the ethnic barrier. And to deliberately reduce the significance of ethnic origin, the author, Anya Wolwitz, what she tries to do is decapitalizes all terms of ethnicity. Now, I think we're probably going to be running out of time, so I won't be getting into the other issues. But what we tried to say today is that Australian poetry speaks for a time and space shaped by continuing change. And politically, Australia is moving away from Britain, and socially, demographic patterns are being altered under pressures of immigration and suburbanization, and with radical experiments being carried on in presentations of the experiences of indigenous peoples and the experiences of women and even of immigrants, Australia's cultural image, it's being continually reinvented even today.